Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Joining me this week, a special guest, someone who has a lot to do with the success of Podcast on the Brink. He was a longtime host of the show, and he's back today. Jerod Morris, someone who I consider a really good friend, the main man over there at the Assembly Call that anchors a lot of the post-game content, Assembly Call Radio, a lot of good content over there at the Assembly Call. Jerod, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink.
Man, it is always good to be back in the friendly and familiar confines here. Good to be here, man.
So, Indiana basketball, the offseason is here. There's a lot of questions going around right now as to what the roster is going to look like next season. But I want to start first with, I think you're the perfect person to ask this question. How do you assess the success of Mike Woodson in his first season as the Indiana basketball coach? I said before the season that kind of the baseline for the program every season, and this is kind of, I think, the expectation, the minimum expectation is to make the tournament. Indiana obviously did that, but there's obviously other things too that kind of go into judging the program and the first season and how it should be viewed by fans. What are just your overall big picture thoughts on Woodson's first season and what he was able to get done in year one in Bloomington?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of Indiana fans, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because, there for a long while, in February and March, in early March, it looked like we were going to really have a disappointing season and a really rough off season. And then, Indiana takes a 17-point deficit in the Big Ten tournament and turns it into one of the most exciting weeks of IU basketball in recent memory. And, as you're going through that, it's so easy to get caught up in how exciting it was and how great those wins were and how important getting back to the NCAA tournament was. And all of those things are true. But I think now that, we've had some time pass since the St. Mary's beat down, and kind of time to take it all in totality, it's an interesting mixed bag. And I think it's really interesting when you compare it to last season, because I went on yesterday, was just looking at the KenPom rankings and was really surprised that, last year Indiana was 50th in KenPom and right now Indiana's 49th, pending, some fluctuations as different teams win and lose. And it's like, now wait a minute. Like this year going into the offseason feels a lot different than last year. And yet, KenPom, which tries to remove a lot of the narrative stuff from it. And it's just like, okay, how well did you perform on a per possession basis, is telling me that this year's team is essentially the same as last year's team. And actually, based on efficiency margin, last year's team was better. So it's like, so what do we take from that? And what I take from it is that, like looking at the per possession stuff and all the analytical stuff is important, but results matter. And, what Mike Woodson did this season and what this year's team did is they delivered really important results. They got to the NCAA tournament. They won an NCAA tournament game. They won a couple of Big Ten tournament games. They ended losing streaks to Purdue and Illinois and Michigan. And that stuff all really, really matters and really helps to shape the narrative of the program moving forward. And so because of that, this season was a success. It wasn't like a smashing success. They did kind of the minimum. They hit the standard. And the reason why I think that has felt like such a success, and maybe even in the aftermath of, beating Wyoming, and maybe even in some of the discussion after the St. Mary's game, I think a lot of fans have viewed it that way and maybe even positioned it as more of a success than it really is simply because it's been so long since we've just met the minimum standard, and so it's like you're crawling through the desert and you finally get some water and it just tastes so good, and it's like the best glass of water that you've ever had, even though in the grand scheme of things, it's just kind of a necessary step, right? So I don't say any of this to take anything away from what this team achieved, because their ability to bounce back from what was a really rough end of February and to put legitimate results in the books matters a ton. But I do think it's important to not overrate it in the sense that, this year's team took advantage of a more favorable schedule to do it. and they got really hot for a week and played great basketball at an important time. That matters, but there's still many more steps for this program to go, to get out of the Big Ten soft middle and continue rising up, because it gets harder and harder. You're facing better and better programs. So there's a mixed bag of feelings. I'm really proud of what the team accomplished. This last week was so much fun. I do think that the program took an important step or two forward in some important ways, but there's still a long way to go. And what happens this offseason to set the team up for next year, and some of the growth, obviously, that we hope to see from Mike Woodson as a college coach and from some of the young players, what happened this season has to be a step toward something better. Otherwise, its meaning is really going to diminish as we kind of put it in context moving forward.
Does the manner in which Indiana lost the game to St. Mary's, and then subsequently seeing how St. Mary's was dismantled completely by UCLA, does that in any way give you kind of the sense of just how far Indiana still has to go? And when you also look at the Big Ten in general, only 2 programs still alive now in the Sweet 16. Does that kind of put things into perspective for you? Just, all right, Indiana got to the tournament, but they were still pretty far off of getting ultimately to the second weekend. And I know some of the St. Mary's result can maybe be attributed to the travel and the amount of games that they played, but they were beaten pretty badly. And then St. Mary's goes on 8 days rest. I mean, they play a game and then have an easy win over Indiana, and they get completely outplayed by UCLA. So to me, it kind of just emphasized, Indiana got to this point, but there's still a ton of room to grow and get better for this program to ultimately get to where it needs to be.
Yeah, that was one of the points that we made on the post-game show, which was, after the St. Mary's game, where it's just like, okay, this was a really bad game for a whole lot of reasons, but getting here really mattered. But this is a reminder of how far Indiana still has to go. And, I hesitate to put too much stock just on that one result, because it really did seem like a confluence of factors. Indiana couldn't shoot. Indiana didn't have a lot of rest. St. Mary's seemed like a particularly difficult matchup for this team on a quick turnaround because of how they play and the problems that was likely to give Indiana. And they were shooting. So, I think everything added up to that result being so bad. And I think if they played that game maybe 10 more times, that would be the worst result for Indiana. I don't know if Indiana wins many of them, but they would have played better, right? And so I don't want to put too much stock into that result, but I think your general point is correct. And I think it's interesting, and you don't want to put too much stock into tournament results, but I do think it's interesting that the 2 teams that most people picked to be the Big Ten's 2 best teams at the beginning of the year, Purdue and Michigan, just based on the talent of their rosters, are the 2 teams left standing. And Michigan, they didn't just waltz in here. They had to beat Tennessee and Colorado State, which are 2 pretty tough matchups. So yeah, I think that is the lesson of the last week of basketball for Indiana, which is that, okay, this year's team had a lot of life left in it. They won some important games. You can kind of start to see the vision here, but boy, there's still a long way to go. Got to get shooters, got to get a whole lot of different things. And in some respects, it looks like you kind of go around the Big Ten and say some of that for a lot of the different programs. But it seems like a lot of Big Ten programs are in transition. Wisconsin seems like they're going to be going through a transition. Iowa probably will too if the Murray brothers leave. Several of these. This is where Indiana has got to take bigger steps forward, I think, than those programs do. There's an opportunity here, but still, yeah, there's a long way to go. And I think it's important to remember that, to be excited about what happened, enjoy it, but still recognize that, yeah, there's a long way to go.
So the season's been over now for just 4 days, and I'm sure you're in the same position in the Assembly Hall community, but in the Inside the Hall community, I'm doing my monthly Ask Me Anything today, and there's a ton of questions about who's coming back, who's leaving. People kind of want to know what the roster is going to look like for next season. And, I know classes are back in session this week in Bloomington, so the players should be on campus, and I assume things like postseason meetings and all that will be happening sooner rather than later. But what, in your mind, are the biggest questions that you have right now in terms of the roster next season? Is it as simple as, is Trace coming back? Is Race coming back? Is it who's going in the portal? How many spots Indiana is going to have open? What in your mind are the most kind of important, immediate questions to answer before we can even start to think about next season?
Well, there were 3 reliable players on this year's roster. Reliable, I guess you could put that in quotes, but there were 3 kind of guys that, that Indiana was built on this year, which is Trace, Race, and Xavier Johnson. And even though those guys had their ups and downs, they were the most consistent from a production standpoint, stood head and shoulders above everybody else. We got to find out what those guys are doing. I think most people have assumed that Trace was just going to be here 1 year under Mike Woodson. I can't imagine that his performance over the last week, which was by far the best he has ever played in Indiana uniform, would dissuade him from moving on if that was his original intention. But, I don't know there. Race Thompson, it seemed like there had been talk during the season, hey, maybe Race is going to come back. He goes through his senior speech, has kind of talked like somebody, who seems like he's moving on. And then Xavier Johnson, it doesn't seem like he has, immediate, NBA potential or anything. But who knows, what happens with him, and does keeping the coaching staff, intact, would that matter to, what he's going to do? Because, he had that pre-existing relationship with Kenya Hunter. So I don't know. I guess to answer your question, we have to find out what those 3 guys are going to do. Because if Trace or Race, or especially if both of those guys leave, well, now, you can't go into next season just relying on Logan Duncombe, Caleb Banks, and Jordan Geronimo to be your front court. You've got to find, guys who can step in and play right away. But same thing with X. If he comes back, he's coming back to have the ball in his hands. And so, but you also have Jalen Hood-Schifino coming in that probably isn't coming in to just take a back seat as a point guard. So how would you play with those 2 guys together, and what kind of guys do you have to fit around them to make that work? So, and then you obviously fill in the pieces around those guys. But X, Race, and Trace were just, given their importance on this year's team, you have to find out what those guys are going to do, figure out who's left, and then, where you go from there. So, there's other decisions that are important, but those certainly seem like the big ones that are going to kind of anchor the offseason.
It's the most wonderful time of the year for college basketball fans, and our friends at Homefield have the world's most comfortable, premium licensed collegiate apparel to get you ready for all of the madness. Run by IU grads in Indianapolis, Homefield produces the most unique apparel designs available for fans of your favorite school. Over 120 different schools are available at Homefield, and more are being added each month. Our current favorites at Podcast on the Brink are the Never Daunted Crimson t-shirt with the IU Oval logo and the vintage Bison mascot hoodie. It's the most comfortable IU hoodie available anywhere. Podcast on the Brink listeners can save 15% off of your first purchase by using code BRINK15 during checkout at homefieldapparel.com. That's code BRINK15 for 15% off of your first purchase at homefieldapparel.com. What sense do you get in terms of name, image, and likeness, and how big a deal that could be for somebody like Trace Jackson Davis? I know you see different things out there, different collectives in terms of raising money for IU athletes and different deals that have been announced. It doesn't, at Kentucky, you hear about Ty Washington driving a Porsche, and, at some of these SEC football schools, you hear about, a lot of money in these deals. At Indiana, it doesn't seem like it's been as big of a deal, or we haven't heard, at least publicly, about big money exchanging hands in terms of NIL deals. For Trace, it seems to me like, there's an argument for him to go ahead and, he's 22 years old now. He could go play professionally somewhere. If it's not in the NBA or the G League, there's certainly a market for him to play professionally somewhere. But it also seems like NIL is kind of hanging out there as this big piece that could potentially, for a guy like him, be lucrative. Have you thought about that at all, and what that could mean potentially for his decision?
I've definitely thought about it. It's interesting because it's still so new, and I don't, necessarily run, in the circles of IU fans that would be, cutting the big checks potentially for NIL. Right. So I don't really know what's happening on that front, but it certainly seems like there would be potential there. And I would certainly think, at a school like Indiana, with a lot of the alumni that we have and just the opportunities that you would think commonsensically that would be there, that he would be able to make as much, if not more, than what his first professional contract could do, I would assume. I mean, right. We've done some small NIL deals with the assembly call, not the kind that would sway anybody's decision, and we would definitely be open to, to doing that with some of those guys as well. And I guess if you add up enough of those, but then also, those guys have to do stuff for that money too. So they have to, perform whatever services are being asked, whether it's endorsements or showing up for interviews, that kind of thing. And they have to balance that with then, studies and all the work that's going to go into the off season. So, it's still so new. It's hard to say, but I do think it's going to be interesting to see this off season. How does that start to affect guys' decisions like a Trace? He's not a Jaden Ivey where it's like a slam dunk. Okay, he's going pro. He would have options. It's possible if Trace leaves that he could get drafted in the second round based on where you see mock drafts. It's possible he could not and have to go to the G League or could go overseas. So there's a lot of options there, and I'm really more curious to see how this plays out than in possession of any knowledge or predictions of how it plays out. But I think he's among the more interesting test cases because of the school that he goes to, the fervor of the fan base, his standing after 3 seasons, but also the professional opportunities that he'll have in his age. I'm really kind of fascinated to see how it plays out, because I think if you see him, come back, especially when it was kind of assumed that he was going to leave after 2 years, and then he even said last year, I think, when he committed to come back, one more go around. So it's kind of been assumed that he would leave. You would have to think that would be a major determining factor there, and potentially a legitimate one. I mean, I know, he's older, and, you think about, okay, every year that's his earning power as a basketball player. So the argument has always been he should get that started sooner. But yeah, depending on what kind of NIL opportunities are there, he may be able to make more this year as an Indiana player and then start his professional career after that. So just curious to see how it plays out, really.
I think at minimum, he has to do the due diligence of seeing what's out there. I know the past couple of off seasons, he didn't even put his name in the draft. I think he has to at least see what is out there in terms of the draft combine. I mean, you learn a lot just by whether or not you're invited to the draft combine. I think that in some ways can make the decision for you. If you're not invited to the combine, you kind of know that there's not a huge amount of interest. So I think at minimum, he should do that. The other kind of thing that's just hanging out there, and I know you talked about X and you talked about Race Thompson and Trace, but there's this other group of players, Miller Kopp, Parker Stewart, Michael Durr, Rob Finney, that are also kind of in the mix in terms of being able to come back next season or obviously move on. I guess if you're the coaching staff or, you as a fan, how do you evaluate those players in terms of how they fit in next season? Because obviously looking at this objectively, all of them had moments this season where you say they were helpful players for Indiana, but there was a lot of instances where if Indiana would have had, a more reliable shooter than, say, Miller Kopp or Parker Stewart at times, they could have won more games. Or if Rob Finney was healthy all season, I mean, we know injuries have been a big part of his career at Indiana. Or Michael Durr. I mean, he obviously played, a decent amount of minutes, but maybe didn't have the impact that some people thought coming into the season. I guess just big picture, how do you evaluate those decisions from if you're the coaching staff and deciding on maybe who you want back and how that all shakes out? I think that too is, as much as we talk about the Race and, Trace and X decisions, I think those other 4 names are just kind of hanging out there, and there's really no clear cut answer as to what's going to happen with any of them right now.
I know. It's difficult, man. Like, you start looking at this offseason and it's really, you kind of think of it from a coach's perspective. Man, it's hard because, like, Rob's an interesting case, right? Like, this is where I think you've got to know what X is going to do. Because if X leaves, okay, now you're going to enter next season with Jalen Hood-Schifino as your presumed starter at point guard. Now, you can argue about whether a freshman point guard is ready to lead a Big Ten team and all that stuff. And those would all be great questions, but he would be the guy getting the ball in his hands. Like, it's tough to get a commitment like that if you're not going to play him. So, but if you don't have X, now, even despite some of Rob's offensive flaws, It's kind of nice to have him in a role like you had this year. He was impactful this year, as a guy coming off the bench and someone who, could provide some senior leadership for Jalen Hood-Schifino as he goes through the Big Ten for the first time. But if you do have Xavier Johnson, well, now, really, where's Rob going to get his minutes? Parker Stewart and Miller Kopp are really interesting test cases because Mike Woodson believed in those guys enough all season long to keep them in the starting lineup. And so I think a lot of the decision on those guys has to go with, what is the coaching staff's evaluation of them? They saw them every day in practice and saw some of the struggles that they had shooting the basketball, where like the final season numbers, I don't think are atrocious for those guys. Let me look at them real quick. Parker Stewart shoots 39.3% from three-point range. Miller Kopp shoots 36.1%. Now, they were terrible on two-pointers, but you can live with those three-point percentages. The problem is a lot of their makes seemed clustered in games where it didn't matter. And when you really needed guys to step up and make shots, outside of a few examples, Miller Kopp had, a couple big games late. They didn't make them when they really counted. But seeing them in practice all the time, knowing them personally, do you believe in them? I don't know. Seeing what we saw in the games, I think it would be hard to have a lot of faith in running it back with those guys. And I think it would be hard to foresee an Indiana season that's better if those are your two wings. But there was a reason why the coaches kept playing them. So I don't know if there's something that we just didn't see there. But it also comes down to opportunity cost. You've got to have some guys who can make shots. So who are you replacing them with? Do you believe enough in Anthony Leal for him to take those minutes? Trey Galloway hasn't shown yet that he's a shooter. Is CJ Gunn going to be ready from day one to play in the Big Ten? He's a shooter, but is he going to be ready? What can you get in the transfer portal? So this is where off seasons now are going to be really hard for coaches, because you have two guys here, and who knows? Parker Stewart went through senior day, so I don't even know if he wants to come back. And I think Miller Kopp is also a guy that, seemed to provide a lot of leadership on the team too. And how much do you value that? That's what I mean. These decisions are difficult, and guys are coming in and out of the transfer portal, so you don't really know who's going to be available. But I think, bottom line, you need to upgrade your shooting. And so that's where, as I look at it, just far removed as a fan who only gets to watch the 40 minutes of basketball and isn't seeing all the practice and all of the other stuff, it certainly seems like you need to upgrade at those positions. And if you don't believe that you have those upgrades internally from another year of development from Anthony Leal, certainly I think you would have to expect that Tamar Bates would be a starter next year, over one of those guys. And maybe, they wouldn't want to accept a lesser role. I don't know. But you've got to find guys who can take and make contested shots in big moments, because it was one of the biggest things lacking on this team. And, outside of just thinking that there are extenuating circumstances for why those guys didn't do it this season, I would think you'd have to look really hard at upgrading. But how do those conversations go? And, who are you looking at? That's where it is a real challenge. And I think I do think fans need to empathize there. It's not like you can just, we're just going to go in the transfer portal and get better guys. Because Parker Stewart and Miller Kopp were supposed to be those better guys, right? And so these are difficult challenges, and I think they're going to be made a little bit more difficult by the fact that this is still, a coach who's going through his first calendar year through this, a staff that is doing this for the second time, together. They're going to have to make some tough decisions, and it's going to be interesting to see what they end up doing, obviously.
March can be a stressful time of year for college basketball fans. That's why I trust my friends at Cornbread Hemp, Kentucky's #1 rated CBD company with over 3,000 5-star reviews. Family owned and operated, Cornbread Hemp provides the highest quality, most potent USDA organic CBD products available with the highest legal level of THC. Not sure which product to choose? Start with their best-selling CBD gummies, made with USDA organic fruit and their signature flower-only hemp extract. Orders shipped directly from their farm in Kentucky, and best of all, Podcast on the Brink listeners get 30% off their first purchase with code HALL. Visit cornbreadhemp.com today and save 30% off of your first purchase with code HALL. I think the other tough thing is, we've talked in this episode, you've talked all season in the assembly call. I've kind of said the baseline for Indiana basketball is making the tournament. But let's say that, Race and Trace or, X or some of these guys move on, and there's kind of this expectation that you need to be better next year or at least as good as you were this year. That becomes difficult, just realistically, when you're losing that type of production. And if you're going to, I think tough. Mike Woodson said as much. We need to be better. It's just tough for me to foresee a situation next season where Indiana is demonstratively better if some of these guys move on because of the unknown of the portal. You're going to be bringing in some young players who, they're talented guys, but we saw this season with Tamar Bates. We saw with some of the Michigan freshmen. We saw with other freshmen who aren't, a top 5 player coming in. There's a lot of variation in terms of the outcome of what a player can be. Just because somebody's a 5-star recruit, we saw it with Christian Lander, doesn't mean that they're going to come in and produce at a high level. And so that to me is kind of the tough thing for Mike Woodson moving forward is how do you balance developing your young players against this pressure of having to be better next season? And does that make you cling more towards a guy like Miller Kopp and Parker Stewart and bring back because these guys, are experienced and have played a ton of minutes, or do you think that they need to, if several of these guys leave, do you think there's an argument of going younger and trying to develop some of your younger pieces, or do you think the pressure of just being better next season is going to outweigh that? Because to me, it's, not to be too long-winded here, it's just hard for me to see them being better next season without Trace and Race and X. We don't know which of those guys are going to leave, but that's a lot of production to replace. I mean, I don't care what kind of players you're bringing in. Those are really good players that are going to be, those are numbers that have to be replaced, and it's hard for me to see that playing out if those guys leave.
Yeah. And this is where I think what Indiana did the last week of this season makes a massive difference. Making the NCAA tournament this year, it doesn't change what the standard is going to be for next year, but I do think it kind of releases a bit of a pressure valve on it. Because if you didn't make the NCAA tournament this year, now you enter next season with the weight of the world, even more than this year, to get back to the NCAA tournament somehow, some way. I think because they made it and put a lot of those old narratives to rest, I don't think it's necessarily like a fresh start next season, but it does feel a bit like a turning of the page. Whereas this year felt like almost a continuation of the Archie Miller era, and you've got all this stuff from the Archie Miller era hanging on you. Mike Woodson turned the page on a lot of that stuff. And so now I think he enters this season with, again, I think the standards are going to be the same. And I think those are going to be fair. I mean, I think it's fair to think that Indiana can field a team that finishes in the top half of the Big Ten, that makes the NCAA tournament. And I'm guessing, now look, if Trace comes back, if all these guys come back, those expectations are going to go up a lot more. But just like if I had to guess what we'll be saying after the full roster is here, I think our expectations will be somewhat modest again, where it's like, okay, if this team can finish top half of the Big Ten, make the NCAA tournament, that's a successful season. But I do think, Indiana fans, for all of the criticism that we get, I do think we're a relatively sophisticated fan base, that if we go through next season and maybe the wins and losses aren't quite what we want them to be, but you're seeing young guys develop, you're seeing the team have more of an idea of what they want to do late game, but maybe just, some young guys haven't come around yet, or you're seeing kind of some struggles of a team that's taking a while to come together. I think fans will be able to put that in context if they see growth, right? And so, and that's where I almost think you make the NCAA tournament this year. I don't think you have to be desperate this offseason. I think you need to think about the next 2 seasons. And so that's where, to me, you prioritize Tamar Bates playing over Miller Kopp or Parker Stewart. You prioritize getting Jordan Geronimo minutes. I think you probably prioritize, hey, what can CJ Gunn do? This guy can shoot, and we need shooting. Same with Anthony Leal. So I would hope, that's my hope anyway. And it's certainly the way that I'm going to approach next season is, let's look at this not just what desperately gets us a result we want this year, which I think can be the dangerous thing about the transfer portal. Let's develop the guys that we have, because I think we all like these recruits, and let's see where we can be at the end of 2 years. And it doesn't mean we don't have expectations for this year, but I feel like if you do that, you'll probably be in a better position come February and March than you would be anyway. So that's how I'm hoping that they look at it. And I think that's the great thing about this last week is it, I think, gives them the ability to actually do it.
Yeah, because if the run didn't happen in the Big Ten tournament and the NCAA tournament appearance didn't happen, what people would be talking about right now is last season, Mike Woodson's first year, was a missed opportunity to develop young players, because really I think that's one thing that drove a lot of fans nuts was, he stuck with these guys. He was ultimately rewarded, but was it at the expense of the development minutes for Jordan Geronimo or Tamar Bates or Anthony Leal? I think that's obviously a kind of a weight lifted off their shoulders, the coaching staffs, because had they not made the tournament, we would be talking about that right now. Why didn't Tamar Bates play more? Why Jordan Geronimo didn't play more?
Yes, 100%. 100%. That's why that result mattered, big time.
So besides shooting, what else do you see as needing to improve dramatically for Indiana basketball? Maybe not this coming season, but in the next 2 or 3 years, is it as simple as make more 3-pointers and shoot free throws better? Or are there other things? Because obviously the defense, you have a top 20 defense. It's hard to do much better than that. But obviously there's going to be guys that are good defensive players moving on from the program. They're going to have to be replaced. But do you see anything else just kind of glaring from a personnel standpoint beyond shooting that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, again, some of this will depend on who stays and who goes. I would just sum it up as scoring. I think it's more than just shooting. I mean, we do need guys who can shoot. There's no question. But I think we also need guys who can go get a bucket. Part of the reason why I think, fans saw Tamar Bates, and it's like, and look, his numbers are not good, right? But you see the flashes of a guy that has the confidence and the ability to go get himself in a position to get a bucket. And maybe as the game slows down and he gets a little bit more physically ready, he's able to convert more of those opportunities. And that's what X was able to do at times. But who else, outside of the guards was able to do that? The ball handlers, no one really. And so you do need guys who can step up and just make open shots. You've got to have that. But then I think you also just need more guys who can go get a bucket. Trey Galloway profiles as a guy potentially like that if he can get better at finishing and his floater's a little bit better, and if he can be a credible outside shooter so that, teams can't play so far off of him. But that to me is the biggest thing. And look, the biggest thing I take out of this first season, because we talked when Mike Woodson was hired, we talked a lot about the offense and how he'll change the offense and all of this stuff. Mike Woodson came in and built a top 25 defense with Parker Stewart and Miller Kopp starting and playing a lot of minutes. And I don't think anybody would say that those guys are great defensive players. Now, I think they ended up being much better defensive players than their reputations. And I think Indiana fans were way too hard on them as defensive players as we went through the season. There were matchups that hurt those guys, but they played hard, and it's a team that played with defensive principles. And so to me, the lesson that Indiana should take from that is, yes, you got to have athleticism, you got to have length, and there's certain things as you want to move up the rungs of college basketball that you need to have. But this coach and this staff seem able to build a defensive identity. And, I think Purdue has done this sometimes where it's like, hey, we're going to take a guy that maybe doesn't profile as a great defensive player, but he's a good shooter and scorer, and let's fit him into a system. Now, it's a bad example for this year because Purdue's defense wasn't very good, but they're also still playing. And they've played better defense when it has mattered recently. And so, that's one of the things where it's like, and I think some of the guys that we've gotten, like a Caleb Banks and Ja'Kai Newton, who's coming in next year, these guys physically profile as really good defensive players. But it's not going to matter if you don't have guys who can score and make shots. So let's trust our ability to build a defensive culture, and let's bring some scorers in here, like a CJ Gunn. Hopefully he, becomes this guy, or like an Anthony Leal, right? If you believe in his shooting, okay, he has defensive limitations, but is he going to be any worse than Miller Kopp defensively? And Miller Kopp was a serviceable defensive player on a good defense. So let's trust that and let's prioritize shooting and scoring the basketball, because ultimately this is why Indiana loses games, because they're not dynamic enough offensively. And this is why they struggle late in games, because if everything doesn't go right from the system and the play and what was designed, they don't have guys who can just go get a bucket when things break down. And if you've watched the NCAA tournament and you kind of are paying attention to, okay, what's the difference between Indiana and these teams? Oh, these other teams have dudes that can just go get a bucket, whether it's a shot or a drive to the lane. And for the most part this season, Indiana didn't really have that. And it makes basketball really, really hard. And a lot of times we talk about all this stuff, why are the coaches doing this? And why are, they're, what are these things? And it's like, well, you're trying to compensate for not having the most important thing in the game, which is guys who can make shots or just go get a bucket. It makes basketball a lot easier. So I just think Indiana needs to make basketball easier on itself and just get guys who can score.
Shifting gears before we wrap up this episode, Jerod, I want to just ask you about the Big Ten. We can, yesterday was Sunday, 1-4 for the Big Ten. Obviously, Purdue marches on. I kind of made my thoughts known on the subject on Twitter. Just to me, I thought it was a really bad day in general for the Big Ten. People point out, well, most of these teams weren't favored to go on. I just think it's been now so long that the Big Ten's won a national championship. Think about this. I was 18 years old the last time the Big Ten won the national championship. I was in the building, sitting in the upper deck of the arena. It was in Indianapolis. They beat Michigan State, beat Florida, I believe it was. It's been 22 years. And obviously this season, there's still a chance with Michigan and Purdue still dancing. Obviously, Indiana fans don't want Purdue to get that elusive first national championship, but it just feels like it's been too long for the Big Ten. We talk all season about how it's such a great basketball conference and how the games mean so much and how it's so tough to go on the road. All those things are true. But you would think at some point, given the amount of resources that are spent by these schools on their basketball programs, given the amount of great coaches that are in this league, that they could finally break through and win a championship. And it just doesn't feel like it's going to happen again anytime soon. 22 years is a long time. What do you make of just this whole situation? I don't know exactly what all the causes of it are, but I think there's some correlation between style of play and the players that come into the league and the officiating. All of those things kind of have something to do with each other, because I think when you have a league that maybe isn't as visually appealing for recruits to watch, when they actually sit down and watch the games, it's not fun to watch Wisconsin play basketball. Yeah, sure, they win a lot of games, but who wants to watch that style of play? They're only going to get a certain type of player. And I think some of these programs kind of pull the other ones down into the mud and force the style of play. And a lot of it has to do with the way the games are called. It's just really frustrating as somebody who really likes the Big Ten and really wants the league to do well, to have this long of a drought. And I think it's a real problem at this point. They definitely need to have more success in the tournament. And I just don't know how it gets fixed. I'm just curious, I know you feel the same way about the league, and you watch a ton of Big Ten and want the league to do well, obviously, but what's the solution? Commissioner Jerod Morris of the Big Ten, how do you fix this? Is there a fix?
Oh, man. I mean, I don't know. I think one of the big takeaways just watching the teams play this weekend is, my God, some good shooting teams shot really poorly. I mean, Iowa's a good shooting team and they couldn't hit anything against Richmond. Illinois is a good shooting team and they couldn't hit anything through 2 games. And I don't know what accounts for that. I think we saw, Indiana really struggle to handle the ball and shoot, but Indiana has struggled to shoot a lot this season. So that didn't really raise any red flags. Right. But more than anything, I just think the Big Ten needs more dudes. And I say that.
How many lottery picks are going to have this year?
Oh, yeah, but hold on.
This is the most. Go ahead.
No, that is true. And that's the thing about this year. Like Jaden Ivey, Johnny Davis, Keegan Murray. Like those guys, the player development for those 3 guys has been phenomenal, and they are lottery picks. But none of those guys was a big recruit, and so those stories, they're not total anomalies, because I think the Big Ten programs are really good, the coaching is really good, but there is something to be said for seeing the top 25, 30 recruits every single year in the McDonald's All-American guys, and they're not coming to the Big Ten. Now, to your point, it's not like Big Ten teams just don't know how to recruit. And for goodness sakes, Indiana has gotten as many of those recruits as anybody outside of Michigan, maybe over the last few years, and Indiana hasn't done anything with them. I do think there's something to the style of play, and you talk with people who follow recruiting, and that does actually seem to be something that's mentioned. So, yeah, from an officiating standpoint, I saw you tweet, hey, Kevin Warren needs to figure this out. And the Big Ten is a great basketball conference. The coaches are good. The fan bases love it. Like, there's passion. And it doesn't really matter how aesthetically pleasing the games are to us. We developed emotional connections with these programs when we're 12. We're going to keep watching no matter what. But we'll be here. Don't worry about us. Some kind of tweaks, and I don't know, maybe the coaches like a Tom Izzo, who's kind of built his brand on that tough physical style of basketball, maybe he doesn't want it to change. But look at that Duke game against Michigan State. That was an awesome game. And Michigan State really for about 36 minutes got everything out of its talent it possibly could. And then Duke just had dudes and took over down the stretch. And that's, to me, what always a lot of times ends up being the difference in these Big Ten games is, you just end up not having enough guys who can just go make those kinds of plays. And so again, I'm basically just answering your question with a question. What can the conference do to get there? There's got to be some kind of style of play element, there to it. And, if that's officiating or what, I think it's at least time for the conference to try something. Let's try something different.
It can't be worse, results. Right? It can't be worse than not winning a championship for 22 years. I mean, I think the most concerning thing to me is when the McDonald's All-American teams came out this year, I'm looking at the list and I'm like, I don't think there's a Big Ten recruit on there. And it's like,
yes,
these kids are going to Auburn. They're going to these SEC schools. And we can talk all we want about
to Auburn,
what these schools are doing, but it's now the NIL era, right? So you can pretty much do what you want to do. I mean, if there's the resources are there, obviously maybe more so at an SEC football school where the money is a little bit bigger, but to me, there's just too many storied programs in this league, too many resources being put in, too many advantages with the Big Ten network and just all that goes with that for the Big Ten to go this long without championship. And I'm not saying that Kevin Warren can do something on his own, but I do think it's got to be something that's prioritized and looked at and at least say, is there something we could be doing better? And maybe you go through a full audit or you bring in some outside people and you look at things and say, well, we're doing what we can do and we're just not good enough. But I would find it hard to believe there's not some tweaks that can be made that can at least, I think, make the product a little bit more fun to watch, because I know there's a lot of complaining about officiating all across the country, but when we know these guys by name, and when you go into the Kohl Center, or you go into the Breslin Center as a Big Ten fan, you don't. A lot of times, you don't feel like you have any chance to win, and why is that? Sometimes a lot of it is just the home court advantage being really good in the atmosphere, but it also just feels like there's some inconsistencies, I will say, in the way that these games are called. A lot of things that are allowed maybe in the Big Ten to go on in terms of the physicality. When you get to the tournament, the game's called a little bit differently. It's an adjustment. And I don't know. It's the reason I even bring it up and talk about it is just because I'm a fan ultimately of the league. I want to see the league do well. And it would be a heck of a lot more fun for the Big Ten to have a national championship here at some point. It's been 22 years, and I think that's been too long.
Yeah. And look, I think you need your flagship programs operating at a high level too. And This is where Indiana has been perhaps the most egregious example of this not happening, because how many Big Ten programs have recruited, like rankings wise, better than Indiana over the past 5 or 6 years? Like a couple, and Indiana hasn't been able to turn that into any type of tournament success, and so Yeah, it's frustrating watching it, but you also, it's weird, it's like you watch a team like Iowa and it's like, man, this team was really good for like 3 weeks. What did I just watch against Richmond? Same with Illinois. Like, what did I watch in these 2 games? That's not the Illinois that I saw. Whether it's style of play or, for Iowa, having to play deep into Sunday and then, have a turnaround a few days later and start the NCAA tournament. But other programs do that and have been fine. So I don't know, or heck, play the Big Ten tournament with the same ball that the NCAA is going to use for the NCAA tournament. Maybe that helps guys adjust a little bit quicker. I don't know. What I'm saying is it does seem like a time. Let's try and figure out some solutions here. Let's try some stuff and see what we can do, because, it does, you can say like, the results in any individual game don't matter because it's the NCAA tournament and wild stuff happens. I would even say the results in an individual NCAA tournament don't really matter because you can just have the whims. But when it is season after season after season and the narrative takes hold, that's the problem. That's the, like I was just saying, that's the difference between Indiana basketball in 2022 and 2021. The 2021 team had a better efficiency margin, but the narrative is drastically different. And narratives matter a lot for recruiting and the stuff that happens in the offseason. And that's where I think it's, is it a crisis? I don't know, but it's certainly a problem for the Big Ten. And so I think just sitting on your hands and doing nothing, even if you don't have the magic solution, try some stuff. Let's see what we can do, whether it's different emphases on recruiting or what it is, but basically, or on officiating, but at least send the signal like there's a problem here and we're going to go about trying to do some things to fix it.
Jerod, I know it's the off season, so things slow down a little bit in terms of post-game shows, but what's the plan for the off season over at the assembly call? You'll obviously still have the Thursday night radio show, I'm assuming, and a lot of good things going on with the community. What is in store for the assembly call this offseason?
Yeah, we'll keep doing our weekly show on Thursday night and, reacting to whatever news there is and just trying to take a bigger picture, broader look at the team and the program. Once we find out who's coming and who's going, reflect on the guys who are staying and kind of dig into their seasons and their growth and what we hope to see from them. And as often as we can, whenever there's important off-season news, whether it's a guy staying or maybe someone from the transfer portal committing or recruiting news, we always like to do those emergency episodes and just kind of go live and react in real time since it's what we do. But I do, the season is always so interesting because it's like you hop on a post-game show and you're just reacting to that raw emotion of the moment. And I think it's useful to do and it's fun to do, but the off season is always fun to really take a step back and, really look at where things are and assess it from a big picture perspective. And I think this is a really, really important offseason for Indiana and how the coaches choose to approach it. And like I said earlier, I'm hoping they take a long-term view. And I think as fans, if that's what you want them to do, then I think you also have to be willing to maybe have an extra shred of patience next season if the results don't come quite as quickly, if we're committed to kind of playing through young players and letting those guys develop. So, we'll do what we can to try and match what we think the fair standards and expectations are with, just kind of what the right perspective is to try and keep everything in and have fun along the way doing it.
Jerod, it was good to have you back on Podcast on the Brink. It's been a long time. It's been, as I've told you before privately, you helped me a ton in terms of just building this show into what it is today. And, I've just kept doing it in large part just because I like doing it, talking about IU basketball, having different guests on each week. And so now that our schedules are a little less hectic, I you mentioned wanting to come back on the show at some point soon. So I texted you this morning and said, when can you come on? We set this up and here we are. Yeah. So just good to have you back on the show.
You too, man. And the show's been awesome. It's, I miss doing it, but I do enjoy having another podcast that I'm not hosting to actually listen to and get really good IU basketball talk. And you've delivered that all season long. So keep up the great work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And we will be back next week at some point with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you do enjoy the show, we would appreciate a rating or a review on iTunes or Spotify. And once again, we'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.